3 weeks before my heart valve surgery, all 7 of my children promised they'd handle everything. I believed them. Day 1, the chair was empty. Day 4, still no one. By day 12, even the nurse stopped asking. On day 15, my eldest finally called not to visit, but to ask for my signature. On the day I was discharged, I called everyone. No one answered. I took an Uber home alone, returning to a house full of silence and broken promises. But when I opened my late wife's desk drawer, I found something I was never meant to see. Welcome! Before we continue, tell us in the comments which part of the world are you joining us from today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Please keep in mind that while this narrative is crafted with fictional elements for your entertainment, the underlying lesson is something everyone should consider for their own future. My name is Raymond Calloway. I am 74 years old, a widower, and for the better part of 4 decades, I kept the books for Dorothy's machine shop with the same green pen, the same lined ledger, and the same belief that a number never lies if you write it down honestly. Dorothy died 11 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 8 weeks from diagnosis to burial, which is the kind of timeline that does not leave room for the things you meant to say. I did not say all of them. I suspect she knew that because she left me instructions. The instructions were not in a letter I found on the kitchen counter. They were not delivered by a pastor or a lawyer at a graveside. They were in a green composition notebook, locked in the bottom drawer of her oak desk, in a safe behind the winter coats in the study closet. She had set it up that way deliberately. The combination turned to her birthday in reverse. The key on my ring without explanation. The label on the notebook spine in my own handwriting. Reading land, do not discard. She had thought of everything, including the fact that I would need to be ready before I opened it. I was not ready for 11 months. Then the last week of October came and put me in the hospital, and when I came out, I was finally ready. But let me start at the beginning, because the beginning is a Sunday, in late September, the last Sunday before the surgery. And there is a grill in my backyard, and hickory smoke climbing straight into a sky with no wind, and all 7 of my children are standing in my yard making promises I believed. I have 7 children. Nathan is 48, my eldest, an architect, who manages property on the side and arrives everywhere with the particular efficiency of a man who has already calculated his exit. Diane is 45, a cosmetic surgeon precise and impatient, the one who inherited my eye for detail and none of my patience for process. Cooper is 43 and has been telling me for 3 years that he is finishing a graduate degree in urban planning, which I believed until October when Dorothy's notebook told me otherwise. Tyler is 41. A real estate broker, always the first to pick up the phone, and always, I now understand, the first to be doing something else while he does it. Melissa is 39, the warmest of all of them, a teacher married to a man named Kevin, whose judgment I have spent several years quietly revising. Jesse is 36 and has been working on finding himself since he was 24, a process Dorothy quietly funded every month without mentioning it to me. Amy is 29, the youngest still in her PhD program, the one I have always believed was simply trying to become something, which turned out to be true, though not in the way I understood it. Those are my 7 children. On the last Sunday before my open-heart surgery, all of them stood in my backyard while I worked the grill and made the same promise in 7 different ways. They would handle everything. I would be taken care of. The house, the food, the hospital visits, the phone calls covered. 7 adults, 1 assignment each, nothing to worry about. I believed them the way you believe something you have spent 50 years wanting to be true. Not naively. Carefully. The way a bookkeeper believes a column that has always balanced before. I turned the brisket at 2 in the afternoon and watched the smoke rise and thought, this is what a man builds a life for. This is what 40 years of opening other people's numbers and closing them honestly looks like when it finally comes back around. 7 children, 1 yard, the smell of hickory, and the sound of overlapping voices, and a sky that had not yet turned the color of what was coming. I did not notice Tyler drift back to the grill until he was already beside me. The others had moved to the patio table. He came and stood at the far side of the grill with his glass in his hand and his eyes on the back fence rather than on me. And he said, in the tone of a man thinking out loud, that land behind the rentals. With the new corridor going in, it must be pretty central now, huh? I turned the brisket. I said I supposed so, that I had not looked at it seriously in a while. Tyler nodded, the way people nod when they have received the answer they expected, and asked if I wanted a beer, and walked back to the table. I want you to hold that moment. Tyler and his glass, me and the tongs. A perfectly ordinary Sunday afternoon. The smoke was straight, and the sky was clear, and I had 7 children, and no reason to doubt any of them. I have since learned that Tyler had looked up the parcel number 3 days before he pulled into my driveway. He had been holding that question about the corridor for 6 weeks, waiting for the right occasion to ask it casually. The Sunday before my surgery was the occasion he chose. I did not know that then. I turned the brisket. I watched the smoke. I was a satisfied man. That is where the story starts. Not in a hospital room, not at a lawyer's desk, but here at a grill in October light. With a man standing at the far side of it, asking about land he had already been researching for weeks. Everything that followed was already in motion. I simply had not learned to read that kind of column yet. The cars left one by one as the light dropped that September Sunday. Nathan first sighting an early Monday. Tyler close behind his glass, empty his question about the corridor already filed wherever he kept things he intended to return to. Melissa last stopping at the door to squeeze my arm and say, "Promise, Pop. I will have the refrigerator stocked before you get home." I thanked her and watched her taillights clear the corner of Heron Street. The yard was quiet. The coals had gone gray. I stood at the grill with the tongs still in my hand and looked at the backyard the way you look at something you have tended for 30 years and suddenly want to memorize the fence line. The cedar stand at the far edge, the flower bed Dorothy had planted along the south wall that I had been maintaining without particular skill since she died. Everything was still in its place. Everything looked the way it always looked. I went inside and washed the grill tools the way Dorothy had always insisted they be washed. Soap hot water dried completely before they were put away, because rust begins where water is left to settle. I had done it that way for 30 years without thinking about it, and that night I thought about it. I thought, this is the last Sunday before the surgery, and I am washing grill tools because a woman who has been gone for 11 months taught me to, and her way of doing it is still the right way. I went to bed at 9:30. My pre-surgical labs were at 7 the next morning, and I wanted to be clear-headed for them. I did not lie awake. I am not a man given to lying awake. I have always found that the mind properly directed can be told when its services are no longer needed for the evening. I directed mine, and it complied. The surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday. 4 days of labs prep and the bureaucratic patience required by modern cardiology. The surgical team was competent and communicating, and Diane had said she would be the point of contact, which I had accepted with the comfort of a man who believes his affairs are organized. I completed each pre-surgical appointment. I answered every question asked of me. I arranged the house the way a man arranges a house when he is preparing to leave it for 3 weeks. Dishes done, bills, forwarded, the thermostat set to the temperature Dorothy always kept it, out of habit rather than necessity. On Wednesday evening, the night before I went in, I sat at Dorothy's desk in the study for the last time before the surgery. I did not open the bottom drawer. I was not ready for what was in it, and I knew I was not ready, and I did not pretend otherwise. I simply sat at her desk in the cedar and paper smell of that room, and looked at the landscape painting on the wall, and thought about nothing in particular for 20 minutes. Then I turned off the lamp and went to bed. Thursday morning, Nathan drove me to Hartwell Regional Medical Center. He carried my bag from the car to the admissions desk and shook my hand at the entrance. and said he would be there when I came out. Those were his exact words. He would be there when I came out. I nodded and went through the doors and did not look back, because I had decided beforehand that looking back was not something I needed to do. They took me to pre-op at 8. The anesthesiologist was efficient and plain-spoken, which I appreciated. He told me what would happen and in what order, and I listened the way I listened to everything, not for reassurance, but for information. What I needed to know was what was coming. He told me. I thanked him. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia took hold was the ceiling of the operating room, white acoustic tile, 4 surgical lights arranged in a square. A ventilation grill in the upper left corner that someone had cleaned recently enough that there was no dust on the louvers. I noticed the louvers the way I notice things I cannot explain the relevance of. Then the room went away. I was in the ICU for 4 days. I know this the way you know. Things that happened while you were not fully present, from paperwork, from the clock on the wall, from the nurse who told me on day 4 that I was being moved to the cardiac ward. I have a partial memory of a ceiling I did not recognize, and a monitoring machine whose rhythm I learned to ignore by the second day. And I have a complete memory of the chair beside the bed, which was empty from the 3rd day onward. On the 2nd day, Nathan sent a text. 3 paragraphs, no question marks. He explained his situation at length, and with the thoroughness of a man who has decided that thoroughness is a substitute for presence. I read it once and set the phone face down on the blanket. That was the beginning of the counting, the kind I had been doing in ledgers for 40 years, except this time the column was people, and the number I did not want to arrive at was already visible from the first entry. 7 children. I had gone into that hospital with 7 promises and the calmest mind I'd had in years. On day 3, I was moved from the ICU to the cardiac ward, room 614, 6th floor. The room had a window that faced east, which I would come to value more than I expected. It had a chair beside the bed, angled the way visitor chairs are always angled toward the patient, toward whoever was supposed to be lying there. I looked at the chair before I looked at the window. It would stay empty for 12 consecutive days, but I did not know that yet. The messages arrived in a pattern I did not recognize until I had been watching it for 6 days. Day 2, Nathan, 3 paragraphs, no question marks. Day 2, also Diane, mid-morning, a patient emergency framed with enough clinical language to make it sound like an ethical obligation rather than a choice. Cooper, that same afternoon, a conference in Phoenix, the flight cost mentioned twice. Tyler, 3 sentences, the last of which read, "I'm handling things on my end," a phrase I turned over in my mind for longer than I expected, without being able to say exactly why it unsettled me. Melissa, on day 3, 2 sick children, a stomach flu moving through the household, an apology that sounded like it cost her something real. Jesse, that evening, a wellness retreat already paid for, and the information that he was with me in spirit. Amy, a roommate's subletting conflict, relayed through Melissa, rather than sent directly, the kind of administrative detail that is easy to fabricate because nobody thinks to verify it. 7 messages, 7 writers, 7 different reasons. All of them by a coincidence that would later strike me as architecturally precise, immovable within the same 4-day window. I read them all on day 4 slowly from the beginning of each thread to the end. One by one, each excuse held. Nathan's deadline was real, I confirmed it later. Diane's emergency was professional and plausible. Cooper's conference had in fact taken place for 2 of the 3 days he cited. Tyler's escrow was genuine. Melissa's children had been sick. Jesse's retreat had been paid for in advance. The only message I could not fully verify was Amy's, but Amy was 29, and I had spent her entire life giving her the benefit of a doubt I was still not ready to withdraw. What I could verify was simpler and more troubling than any individual excuse. I had announced this surgery 3 weeks before the September Sunday. My children had known the admission date, the surgical team, and the recovery timeline since the afternoon of that last backyard cookout. 7 adults. None of them without resources. none of them farther than 4 hours by car from Hartwell, had produced 7 simultaneous immovable conflicts in the same window following a cardiac procedure. When I totaled that column, the number did not balance. A column that doesn't balance looks innocent until you find what was left out of it. On day 5, they moved me from the ICU to room 614 on the cardiac ward. The room had an east-facing window and a visitor chair angled toward the bed. The chair was the first thing I looked at when they wheeled me in. It would be the first thing I looked at every morning for the next 15 days. For the same reason, a bookkeeper checks the opening balance before he begins a new column. Not because he expects it to have changed overnight, but because verification is the discipline. And the discipline is what keeps the record honest. The messages thinned after day 5. Nathan went from 3 paragraphs to 11 words to 4 words to 2 words to nothing across 5 days, with the gradual economy of a man editing a draft toward its essential minimum. Diane sent 1 line on day 6 and nothing after. Cooper tracked Nathan's trajectory closely enough that I began to wonder whether they had discussed it. Tyler's silence began on day 5, not the silence of someone who had run out of things to say, but the quieter silence of someone who had finished what they needed to do and saw no reason to maintain the performance past its usefulness. Amy sent a thumbs-up emoji at 11:43 p.m. on day 8. I noted the time. I noted the emoji. I did not respond. Only Melissa continued intermittently, with the sustained effort of someone who knew what the other's silence meant and was trying to compensate for it alone. That effort had a weight I recognized, even if I could not yet name what she was compensating for. On the morning of day 12, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, working the top button of my shirt, when Grace Ellsworth appeared in the doorway. She was not on a scheduled visit. She was the charge nurse of the cardiac ward, 36 years old, with the kind of calm that comes not from detachment, but from having decided some years ago. That steadiness is a form of service. She stepped in, fastened my button in one motion, and pulled the visitor chair away from the wall. She sat down in it. I want you to understand what that meant after 12 days. She asked whether I had family nearby. I said, of course, 7 children. The words came out in the right order with the right factual content and fit the situation the way a coat fits a man who has lost weight, the shape correct, the size wrong. Grace nodded without a follow-up, which told me she had worked cardiac wards long enough to understand what 7 children and an empty chair in the same sentence usually means. She stayed for 6 minutes. She adjusted the pillow behind me before she left, and she paused at the door and said without looking back, "I always come when you ring." I sat with that sentence after she left. Then my phone lit on the tray table. Nathan. A message asking me to sign something before discharge. He had not visited in 12 days. He needed a signature. I set the phone face down and looked at the chair, still holding the faint impression of someone having been in it. The first person in 12 days to sit there had been a nurse I had known for 8 of those days. I did not yet know what Nathan needed me to sign, but I knew in the way a bookkeeper knows when a column has been set up to produce a specific answer that the request had not arrived by accident, and that the timing, 12 days in, 1 week before discharge, was not a coincidence any more than the empty chair had been. I set the phone down. I looked out the east window. The parking lot was filling up the way it filled every morning on its own schedule, indifferent to what was happening on the 6th floor. I watched it for a while. Then I reached for the bell. I wanted to see how long it would take. 3 weeks before I let a surgeon open my chest, every single one of my children stood in my backyard and made me a promise. I believed every word. I want to be clear about that. I was not naive. I was not a man given to wishful thinking. I had spent 40 years reading ledgers, and a ledger does not reward optimism, it rewards accuracy. But a man of 74 standing at a grill, he has fired every Sunday for 3 decades. Hickory smoke climbing straight into a September sky with no wind to argue with it. Surrounded by his 7 children and the sound of overlapping voices and the hiss of brisket on hot grates, that man is not reading a ledger. That man is reading something else entirely. I was reading love. I was wrong about the addition. The grill was already at temperature before the first car pulled in. It always was. I started it before noon, regardless of who was coming, because the coals need time to settle and there is no substitution for that. 30 years of Sunday cookouts had taught me that the only thing worth trusting is a process that has been respected. Nathan arrived first, carpooled with Diane, carrying nothing, wearing the expression of someone who expects gratitude simply for appearing. "Dad, you didn't have to do all this," he said, gesturing at the yard, the way you gesture at a minor inconvenience. "We could have ordered something." He said that every time. He never brought anything either. Diane was already talking about the surgical team before she had set her bag down, speaking about pre-op protocols the way someone speaks when they have decided they are the expert in the room and are simply waiting for everyone else to acknowledge it. "Dad, I'll be the point of contact with the surgical team," she said. "I know how hospitals work." I thanked her. I believed her. Cooper arrived alone and greeted me with a firm handshake instead of a hug, and immediately checked his phone. He had driven from Asheville 2 hours voluntarily and offered to manage the insurance calls. I received both facts without comment. Tyler arrived last with a bottle of wine he had clearly selected for himself, held angled toward his own eyeline, not offered outright. He had the easy smile of a man who has already done his homework and is simply enjoying the day until the results are useful. I did not know that then. I am telling you now. 7 children, 1 yard, and not one of them brought charcoal. Melissa was the most genuinely warm of all of them, the only one who hugged me first and asked how I was sleeping. She told me she would have the refrigerator stocked before I got home from the hospital. "Promise, Pop," she said, and I think she meant it when she said it, which is the quiet tragedy of Melissa's promises. Jesse, quiet and agreeable as always, offered to drive without being asked. It was the most he had volunteered for in some years, and I received it with more gratitude than I showed. Amy, the youngest, found me at the grill and said the hickory smoke smelled amazing and that she had missed this. Of all the things said to me that afternoon, I find I cannot fully fault her for any of them. By early afternoon, the brisket was done and the promises had been made, and I stood at the grill with the tongs in my hand, listening to 7 voices tell me my affairs were in order. Nathan had the house. Diane had the hospital. Cooper had the insurance. Tyler would keep an eye on things, which is exactly as vague as it sounds. Melissa had the food. Jesse had the driving. Amy would visit every other day. 7 children, 7 assignments. I believed, covered. The yard went quiet as the light dropped. Nathan first sighting an early Monday. Tyler close behind his glass, empty his question about the corridor already put away in whatever drawer he kept things he intended to return to. I stayed at the grill until the last tail light cleared Heron Street. The coals had gone gray. The smoke had thinned to nothing. I was not lonely. I want to be accurate about that. What I felt was something closer to completion. A man whose house was in order, whose affairs were arranged, who had done the right thing by the people he loved, and received their assurances in return. I stood there in the cooling yard, and believed every word of it. A satisfied man goes to bed early. I went inside past the study without pausing, the notebook still in its drawer, the house holding its quiet, and set my alarm for 6. 7 children, 7 promises. The surgery was 4 days away, and I had not a single doubt to carry into it. How many times does a man have to be the last one standing before he understands what that means? I did not ask that question that night. I was still too satisfied to know it needed asking. The first thing I saw after 6 hours on that table was a ceiling I didn't recognize. The second thing I saw was the chair. It was a standard hospital chair, gray padded seat, metal frame, the kind that exists in every room of every ward of every medical facility in the country, because someone once decided that visitors need somewhere to sit. It had been pulled close to the bed and angled slightly toward me the way you angle a chair when you mean to use it. No one was in it. No one had been in it. I looked at it for longer than I looked at anything else in that room, which tells you something about the state I was in. A nurse came in and checked the monitors with the efficient calm of someone who has done the same thing several thousand times and finds it neither tedious nor remarkable. I asked whether anyone had called. She told me she would check at the station and went out. She came back 10 minutes later and said there were no messages yet and that I should try to rest. I thanked her and looked at the ceiling instead. The surgery had gone well. I knew that from the paperwork and from the way the doctor spoke to me, the clipped satisfaction of a man reviewing his own clean work. My chest had a new valve and a long scar, and the hollow ache of a body that has been opened and reassembled. That was the physical inventory. The other inventory, the one I was already compiling from the gray chair beside my bed, was a different matter entirely. The first message arrived that afternoon. 3 paragraphs, no question, marks the format of a man who had decided thoroughness was a substitute for presence. I read it carefully, the way I read everything, not for what it said, but for what it left out. The Henderson contract. The Thursday close. The assurance that I would be stronger by the weekend, which was doing a lot of work as a substitute for actually coming. 3 paragraphs in which my eldest son explained with considerable thoroughness why he could not be in the same room as a man who had just had his chest opened. I set the phone face down on the blanket. I did not respond. There was nothing in those 3 paragraphs that required a response. The messages came the way debts come, one at a time, each with its own reasonable explanation, until you have enough of them to see what they add up to. I did not read them individually. I read them as a set, the way you read a ledger at the end of a quarter, rather than line by line. Taken together, they produced a number I recognized: 0. 0 visits. 0 calls placed. 0 instances of a person driving 4 hours to sit in a chair beside a hospital bed. The arithmetic was clean. The conclusion was not one I wanted to write down. 7 locks. 7 different keys, except every lock opened onto the same empty room. On day 3, Grace Ellsworth came by during rounds. Not a scheduled check, just a pause at my door, the brief courtesy of a nurse who has decided to notice a patient. She asked whether family had come by. I told her everyone was coordinating, that it was a busy time of year. She nodded without the expression people use when they are politely concealing their opinion of what they have just heard. She adjusted my IV line and set a fresh cup of water within reach on the tray table, and she said she would make sure the chair stayed close to the bed. It was not a significant thing. I have thought about it many times since. I need you to understand something about reading a ledger twice. The first time you find the numbers. The second time you find the story the numbers are trying to tell. On day 4, I read all 7 threads again from the beginning, slowly on a single scroll. One by one, each excuse remained plausible. Nathan's deadline was verifiable. Diane's emergency was professional. Cooper's conference was real. I would later confirm he had attended it for 2 of the 3 days he cited. Tyler's escrow was genuine. Melissa's children had in fact been sick. Jesse's retreat had in fact been paid for. Amy's subletting conflict had in fact not existed at all, but I did not know that yet. What I knew was simpler and more troubling. I had announced this surgery 3 weeks in advance. My children had known the admission date, the surgical team, and the recovery timeline since the afternoon of that last backyard cookout. 7 adult people, none of them without resources, none of them farther than 4 hours by car, had produced 7 simultaneous immovable conflicts in the same 96-hour window following a cardiac procedure. I set the phone down on the blanket and looked at the empty chair beside my bed. I had spent a career reading columns that were designed to look balanced. I knew what coordinated absence looked like. What I did not know yet was what they were all absent for, and that gap between what I could see and what I could not was the most unsettling number I had encountered in 40 years of keeping other people's books. They moved me to room 614 on the 5th day. The new room had a window. I noticed the chair before I noticed the view. It was against the wall on the right side of the bed, angled the same way the ICU chair had been, toward the mattress, toward the patient, toward whoever was supposed to be lying there. I had the thought that every room in every cardiac ward in the country probably had a chair in the same position, and that most of them got used, and that the statistical likelihood of a chair sitting empty for 12 consecutive days was low enough that someone with actuarial training would find it noteworthy. I did not have actuarial training. I had 40 years of bookkeeping, which is close enough. The window faced east. In the mornings, the light came in low and direct, and I found that I was grateful for it in a way that surprised me, not moved, exactly just recalibrated. After 5 days of ceiling tiles, a window felt almost extravagant. I watched the parking lot fill up at 8 in the morning and empty again at 5 in the evening, and I understood that I had begun to measure time the way people measure time in institutions, by what reliably appears and disappears. The meal cart came every morning at 7:15. In 12 days, it never once sent a group text. By day 6, I had learned the floor. The wax smell hit at 10 sharp and institutional, drifting in under the door from somewhere in the corridor. Shift change happened at 6, announced by a pattern of footsteps, 2 sets arriving, 2 sets departing. A brief overlap of voices too low to make out, and that rhythm became as reliable as anything in my previous life had been. I began to read the hospital schedule the way I had always read a ledger, not for what it told me to do, but for what it told me to expect. There was comfort in that. A ledger does not make promises it does not intend to keep. The children's texts thinned to almost nothing over days 7 through 11. On day 9, Nathan sent a message to the family group thread, "Thinking of you, Dad." 7 names on the thread, 1 message. No individual effort required. I read it and set the phone face down and looked out the east window at a sky that was doing nothing in particular, and I found that I preferred it. By day 11, the ward had become its own kind of ledger. I knew its rhythms, the way I had known every accounting system I had ever worked in, not because I had studied it, but because I had been inside it long enough that the patterns had simply become visible. The floor wax at 10. The meal cart at 7:15. Shift change at 6, never a minute early. What I did not know, what I was still working out, was what Nathan's message sitting unread on my tray table since the previous evening actually required of me. He had asked for a signature, not a visit, not a call. A signature sent digitally that would take only a moment. I had read the request 3 times and set the phone face down each time, which told me something about what my instincts already understood before my thinking caught up. A bookkeeper learns early that the most dangerous line in any document is the one that looks routine. A signature line with no context attached, requested at a distance from a man who had not set foot in this building in 11 days, that was not a routine line. I did not know yet what it was attached to, but I had spent enough years reading the entries people hoped you would sign without examining to know that the moment someone tells you it will only take a moment is precisely the moment to take longer. I set the phone in the drawer of the bedside table, not face down this time. In the drawer out of sight, where I would not be tempted to read Nathan's message again before I had decided what I thought about it. The east window had gone dark by 7. The parking lot was reduced to a handful of overnight lights. The security post at the entrance, the stairwell exit signs, the glow from the emergency bay at the far end of the lot. I had watched that lot fill and empty for 11 consecutive days, and I had found somewhere in that repetition the particular steadiness of a man who has stopped waiting for something to change and started paying attention to what is actually there. What was actually there, an empty chair. 11 days. 7 children. 1 signature request from a man who had not visited. I was still holding the phone face down when the ward went quiet for the night. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed, The monitoring machine beside the bed continued its ordinary rhythm. I looked at the east window, dark now, the parking lot reduced to overnight lights, and I thought he has not visited in 11 days, and he needs something from me. That is the shape of this. That is what the column looks like when you finally read it correctly. I did not reach for the bell that night. I lay in the dark, with the chair beside me and the phone in the drawer, and the question Nathan had placed in my hands, without meaning to answer it yet. The answer would come. It always did if you gave it the right conditions, and did not rush it toward a conclusion it had not yet earned. The doctor would tell me in 4 days that I could go home. I did not know that yet. What I knew was that something had been set in motion before I went into surgery, and that the signature Nathan needed was not a small thing, and that a man who has spent 40 years reading what numbers mean when arranged in a particular order does not sign a document he has not read, simply because someone tells him it will only take a moment. I reached for the lamp and turned it off. The room went dark. I closed my eyes. I had one more thing to do before I slept, and I did it the way I had always done the last thing. At the end of a long day, at the desk, I opened the account in my mind, ran the column one more time, confirmed the total and set it down. The total was not what I had brought into that hospital. The number had changed. I did not yet know by how much, but I knew the direction. And in 40 years of bookkeeping, I had learned that the direction is always the first thing that matters. I rang the bell at 6:48 the next morning. I was not in pain. I wanted to see how long it would take. This requires a small explanation. I had spent 40 years keeping books, and the first rule of bookkeeping is that you do not trust a number because it appeared once. You verify it. You run it again. Grace had told me she always came, and I had heard her say it, and I had believed her in the way a man believes something he wants to be true, but has not yet confirmed. At 6:48 on the morning of day 13, I decided to confirm it. She arrived at 6:50 and 51 seconds. I had been watching the ceiling clock. She came in without hurrying, without any expression that suggested she had been interrupted, and asked what I needed. I told her water. She poured it from the pitcher on the tray table, set the cup where I could reach it without leaning, and asked whether I had slept. I said reasonably well. She nodded and went back into the corridor. 2 minutes, 51 seconds. I drank the water. I did not mention the test. I put a check mark in a column only I could see. Day 14 was the first walking day. The physical therapist. A compact, unhurried man who introduced himself and immediately forgot I had any questions. Cleared me for corridor walks with the walker morning and afternoon, building from 1 length to 2 over the following week. Grace was in the corridor when I came out of room 614 for the first time. She did not position herself beside me or offer commentary. She simply remained at the nurse's station at the far end, doing whatever she would have been doing if I had not been there. And when I reached the end of the corridor and turned and came back, she had not moved and had not made anything of it. There was a small square of coffee cake on my tray when I returned to the room. No note. I ate it and looked at the window for a while and thought about the difference between a gesture that costs nothing and a gesture that comes from the right instinct. And I concluded they are not the same thing even when they look identical from the outside. Days 15 through 18. I spent watching my children's messages contract. I want you to understand what I was watching. Not a family falling apart. A family revealing itself one fewer word at a time on a schedule they did not realize I was keeping. Day 15. Nathan sent 11 words. Something brief about hoping I was improving, no question mark at the end. Day 16, 4 words, a truncated version of the previous message as though he were editing an earlier draft toward its essential minimum. Day 17, 2 words. Day 18, nothing. Diane sent a single line on day 16 and nothing after. Cooper matched Nathan's trajectory almost exactly, which I noted as a possible indicator of coordination, or a possible indicator that the two of them had always been more similar than I had allowed myself to understand. Tyler sent nothing after day 15, but Tyler's silence had a different quality from the others. Not the trailing off of someone who had run out of things to say, but the quiet of someone who had finished what they needed to do and saw no reason to maintain a performance past its usefulness. Amy sent a thumbs-up emoji at 11:43 p.m. on day 18. I wondered whether she had set a reminder. I completed my second full corridor walk on the evening of day 19. The corridor was longer than it looked from the doorway, which I found to be a reliable metaphor for most things in life that require more from you than the initial view suggests. My grip on the walker was steadier than it had been on day 14. I had stopped counting my steps by day 17 and started counting my pace instead, which is a different measurement and a more useful one. Grace stopped by at the end of her shift that evening. She came in, looked at me sitting in the bed with the tray table pulled close, and said that I had done good walking today and that 2 full corridor lengths was ahead of where most people were at day 19. I told her I was considering 3 tomorrow. She said that sounded like a reasonable decision. And then she adjusted the pillow behind me without asking and crossed to the door and pulled it to not closed. Not fully open, but at the exact angle that reduced the corridor light to a manageable level without making the room feel sealed. A good bookkeeper knows the difference between a number that is wrong and a number that has been arranged to look right. Grace pulled that door to the exact right angle. My children had been arranging numbers for years. She was gone before I had finished the thought. I sat in the room with the pillow at the right angle, and the door at the right angle, and the corridor quiet outside, and I began in a methodical and unhurried way to think about what happened next. Not what would happen to me. What I was going to do. The doctor would tell me in the morning that I could go home. I had known it was coming since day 17 from the shift in how they spoke to me, less instruction, more preparation. I had one more night in room 614, and I used it the way I had always used a quiet evening before a new column needed opening. I made a list. Not of groceries, not of medications. A list of people to call, and the first name on it was Arthur Pennington. Grace pressed the transport slip into my palm at 7:43 in the morning, 45 minutes before Marcus arrived. I had been dressed since 6:30. The discharge paperwork was signed. The medication schedule was folded in my jacket pocket, and the overnight bag was on the floor beside the bed with the zipper closed. I had been ready for an hour before anyone official arrived to confirm that I was allowed to leave the patience of a man who has spent 20 days in a place he did not choose and is now prepared to act on his own judgment again. The attending physician came through at 7:20 with the brisk satisfaction of a man reviewing clean work. He checked the chart, asked 3 questions, noted my answers, and told me I was cleared. He gestured toward the door as though the exit were self-evident. I thanked him. I waited until his footsteps faded before I stood and picked up the bag. Grace appeared in the doorway. While I was doing a final check of the tray table, a habit from 40 years of closing a desk and confirming nothing had been left behind. She came in the way she always came in, without announcement, without the preliminary softening people use when they are about to deliver something. She crossed to the nurse's station, dialed a number from memory, spoke briefly, and came back with a torn notepad slip. She set it in my open palm and said, "Transport confirmed 45 minutes, booking number is on the slip." I looked at the slip. Her handwriting was level and unhurried. I looked at her. "Grace," I said. She waited. There were things I could have said. I had been composing versions of them since day 14. When I understood that this woman had pulled that visitor chair away from the wall and sat in it, not because her job required it, but because she had decided it was the right thing to do. I had kept other people's accounts for 40 years, and I knew the difference between a transaction and a gift. What Grace Ellsworth had given me across 20 days was not in any ledger I could show anyone. It was in the column a man carries with him when he leaves. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, the nod of a person who has received thanks without needing it, and went back into the corridor. I listened to her footsteps disappear into the ordinary sounds of the floor. Then I did one last thing before I left. I straightened the visitor chair flat against the wall, parallel the way it had been before she moved it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up the bag and my walker and went out. The corridor had the particular smell of a Tuesday morning shift in full operation floor wax from the overnight cleaning crew, the meal cart already making its rounds at the far end. I had walked this corridor twice a day since day 14, 41 steps from my door to the elevator, longer than it looked from the threshold which I had noted on the first walk and confirmed on every walk since. I made those 41 steps one last time and did not hurry. Marcus Trent was already in the discharge bay when I came through the lobby doors. He was standing outside the transport van with his hands in his jacket pockets, not leaning, not checking his phone, simply present. The way a man is present when he has arrived early and is comfortable with the fact of it. He saw me and walked over without hurrying. "Mr. Calloway," he said. He reached for the bag before I could shift my grip. "I've got that." He carried it to the van and held the door while I managed the step up, the steady peripheral presence of someone who has helped many people into vehicles after long hospital stays and understands that the help is best delivered without drawing attention to the need for it. I settled into the seat. Marcus closed the door and pulled into the discharge loop without ceremony. We cleared the hospital entrance and turned onto the bypass. Hartwell looked the way it always looks in October, the maples already at full color, the light catching the storefronts on 4th Street and making them look briefly significant. I had been inside a building for 20 days. The outside had continued without adjustment. We were past the Meridian Shopping Center when Marcus spoke, eyes on the road, asking it the way you ask about the weather, someone waiting at home. I said, "I have 7 children." He said, "That's a lot of people." He did not add to it. He did not say he was sure they had good reasons or that families were complicated. He simply acknowledged the arithmetic and returned his attention to the road. And I looked out at the October maples and thought about the difference between a person who says the right thing and a person who says nothing wrong. Marcus turned onto Heron Street without being directed and pulled into the driveway of the house I had lived in for 31 years. The driveway was empty. The lights were off. The curtains were exactly where I had left them on the morning I went into surgery. He carried the bag to the front door and set it inside the threshold. "He asked you all right?" I said yes. He looked at me the way a person looks when they are deciding whether to accept an answer. Then he nodded and walked back to the van. I listened to the engine diminish down Heron Street and disappear. I closed the door. The house had the smell of 20 days of no one-dust stillness, the faint staleness of sealed rooms. I stood in the hallway and let it settle. Nathan had promised food. I walked to the kitchen. Dorothy's handwriting was smaller than I remembered. Precise. Every entry level on the line, nothing crossed out. She had been keeping this for years. I had come straight to the study from the front door, still in my jacket. The overnight bag dropped in the hallway. The notebook was where I had left my hand 2 weeks before, in the bottom left drawer of the oak desk, its green fabric cover smooth under my palm, the label on the spine still carrying those 4 words I could not explain. I had opened it this time before I could think of a reason not to. The heading on the first page read, "Family Accounts," in Dorothy's hand, and beneath it a date, March 2019. 6 years ago. The entries were organized by child, each section separated by a ruled line. Each line dated and annotated with the same spare discipline she had applied to everything she had ever done quietly and well. I recognized the structure immediately. She had been keeping a ledger, a proper one, running totals in the margin, single-line context notes beside each figure. She had been a better bookkeeper than I ever gave her credit for, and I had been a bookkeeper for 40 years. Nathan's section came first. A roof loan from 2021, $9,200, terms unspecified, repayment date blank. 2 years had passed. The repayment column was empty. I noted it and turned the page. Diane, rent arrears from her practice's lean year, covered in installments across 14 months, never discussed with Raymond, never repaid. The total in the margin was larger than I expected. I noted it and turned the page. Cooper had been lying about graduate school for 3 years. Dorothy had verified it. She had not said a word to me. She had written it down instead. That was the entry that stopped me. Not the dollar amount, though the amount was not small, but the marginal notation. In Dorothy's hand in blue ink from one visit, verify. Then beneath it in slightly different ink from a later date, unverified. Program does not exist. She had checked. She had confirmed her suspicion, recorded the confirmation, and gone back to making Cooper's dinners when he visited. I sat with that for a while. Melissa's section documented monthly support payments for Kevin's ongoing medical care, legitimate, Dorothy had noted, but undisclosed to Raymond. Not fraud, just a private arrangement between a mother and her daughter that had been running since Kevin's diagnosis and that I had never been told about. I held that one at a different angle than the others. It did not sit in the same column. Jesse, an allowance. Dorothy had been paying it since he was 24 years old. He was 36 now. I read the section twice, because the first read did not produce a number I was willing to accept without verification. The figure in the margin at the bottom of his page was $43,200. 12 years of monthly payments never mentioned, never questioned, still active as of Dorothy's last entry, 6 months before she died. I need you to understand what one line means in a ledger, where every other entry runs a full page. It does not mean less information. It means the information is somewhere else. Tyler's section was one line. T asked about the land again. Parcel 14 and 15 Corridor Road. Note attached in envelope. That was all. No dollar amount. No date of transaction. No repayment column because there had been no transaction to repay. Just a notation that Tyler had asked about the land. The word again suggesting this was not a new inquiry, but a recurring one, and that Dorothy had prepared a separate note on the subject and placed it somewhere else. One line where every other child had filled a page. Dorothy had decided one line was enough for Tyler. I found that to be the most alarming sentence I had read all afternoon. I knew parcels 14 and 15. They sat behind the rental units on Corridor Road, land I had owned for 31 years. Land I had not thought about seriously in at least a decade. Tyler had apparently not stopped thinking about them. The phrase "note attached in envelope" sat at the end of the line like a door I did not yet have a key to open. Amy's section was brief, a single loan from 2022, an amount smaller than any of her siblings repaid in full within 3 months. Dorothy had written one word beside it in parentheses, legitimate. That word in parentheses in that specific position told me everything about what Dorothy had thought of the others. I turned to the last page, Arthur Pennington, a phone number. And in Dorothy's hand, in the same blue ink she had used throughout the envelope, is in the safe, Raymond. You will know when. She had written that before she died. She had known I would be sitting at this desk in this dark, reading this notebook. She had left me a map and trusted me to read it. I had never loved her more than I did in that dark room. I had not noticed the light going. The room was fully dark by the time I turned to the last page, and I did not reach for the lamp. I sat in the dark with the notebook in my lap and the safe behind the landscape painting on the wall to my left. And Dorothy's last instruction, still in front of me on the page I could no longer see. The room had been dark for some time. I did not open the safe that night, but I knew what I was going to do in the morning, and the first thing was to call Arthur Pennington before any of my children knew I was home. The combination came to me before I reached the safe. I did not search for it. It arrived the way a familiar weight does not remembered so much as resumed. Dorothy's birthday backward, month, day, year reversed. I had never written it down. I turned the dial. The safe was a Century 1250 bolted to the floor of the study closet. Dorothy had chosen it. She had chosen most things in that room, including the placement low behind the winter coats, requiring a person to kneel. I knelt. The dial clicked 3 times. The handle released on the first pull. Inside a manila envelope, letter-sized, unsealed. A folded deed. A small ring box closed. The envelope was on top. It was labeled in Dorothy's handwriting, not neat, not hurried. Deliberate. 2 words for Raymond. I sat on the floor of the closet with my back against the doorframe. The coats hung above me. They still held a trace of her cedar and wool. I did not open the envelope immediately. I set it on my knee and looked at the 2 words for what I estimate was 3 minutes. It is the kind of interval a person cannot explain to someone who has not earned it. I opened it. The letter inside was 1 page. Front only. Her handwriting blue ink, the same pen she used for the green notebook. She had dated it August 14th, 2023, 14 months before I went into the hospital. 14 months before the Sunday barbecue. 14 months before all of it. She wrote Raymond. If you are reading this, then I was right, and you already know most of what I'm about to say. I did not tell you while I was living because you would have tried to fix it. I didn't want it fixed. I wanted it recorded. I read the paragraph again, then a 3rd time. The language was hers, precisely economical, slightly impatient, and without apology. She was not asking forgiveness. She was handing me a file. She went on the notebook shows what was taken and what was given again and not repaid. The deed in the envelope is for the eastern parcel, 380 acres, registered solely in my name since 2019. Tyler does not know this. He has been researching a parcel that no longer exists under the address he has. I moved it. Arthur Pennington has the transfer records. I stopped. 380 acres. In her name alone. She had restructured the land, holding quietly, legally, without a word to me 4 years before she died. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was closer to the sensation of stepping onto a floor you thought was wood and finding it was stone. Solid. Colder than expected. Holding more weight than you thought anything could. She had known Tyler was researching the property. She had moved it before he could find it. She had left me the deed. She had left me Pennington's name. I sat on the closet floor for another interval I did not measure. I am 74 years old. I have closed 14 business deals, raised 7 children, buried a wife, and survived a cardiac event that the doctor described as a significant episode. I have never in that span been outmaneuvered by someone on my side. I did not know that was possible. I am revising that assessment now, sitting on the floor of a closet, holding 1 page of blue ink from a woman who has been dead for 11 months. The deed was exactly as she described. Eastern parcel, 380 acres, Dorothy Ann Calloway, sole registered owner, dated March 2019. Transfer of ownership, line blank. Waiting. The ring box I left closed. I read the letter a 4th time. The final paragraph, Pennington will be expecting your call. I told him Raymond will either call within 2 days of finding this, or he will take 3 weeks and a cup of bad coffee to work up to it. He has the full file. You don't have to explain anything to him. He already knows. I love you. I told you first. D. I stayed on the floor long enough for the light in the study to shift. The afternoon had gone thin and pale through the window. My knees registered the cold from the tile. I stood slowly, no performance in it. No audience to consider, just the cold tile under my knees and the time it took. I folded the letter along its original creases. I placed it back in the envelope. I set the deed on top of Dorothy's green notebook, which was still open on the desk, to the page with Pennington's number. I picked up the phone. He answered on the 2nd ring. Not the voice of a man who had just been interrupted. The voice of a man who had been sitting near the phone. Mr. Calloway, he said before I had finished saying my own name. I've been expecting your call. Dorothy told me you'd get there in 2 days. She was right. I have everything ready. When would you like to come in? I looked at the deed on the desk. I looked at the 2 words on the envelope for Raymond, and I understood then that the letter was not a farewell. It was a briefing. "Tomorrow morning," I said. Arthur Pennington confirmed the time, gave me an address I did not need to write down, and ended the call in under 40 seconds. Efficient. Prepared. Already holding something I had not yet asked for. I set the phone down. The ring box was still on the shelf of the safe, closed. I had not touched it. I did not know what was in it. That was the first thing in 11 months that Dorothy had left me that I could not yet account for. I had looked out that kitchen window 10,000 times. I had never once looked at the land behind Birch Hollow and thought that belongs to me. The parcels were still there in the gray morning light, same as always. A fence line running east. Scrub growth pressing against the posts. A stand of cedar at the far edge that had been there since before any of us put names on paper. From this window in this kitchen, I had made coffee and read the paper and watched those trees change color 41 autumns in a row without once asking what they were worth. Dorothy had been standing in this same kitchen, looking at this same fence line, and she had been asking that question the entire time. I tucked her letter into my inside jacket pocket. The same folds she had made exchanging the brief professional acknowledgement of attorneys who have arrived at the same table from opposite directions. I wanted it close for the meeting. I could not have told you why exactly. She was already gone. The letter was just paper and ink. But I did not want to leave it on the table alone, and I did not question that instinct. Some things a man does not need to audit. I dressed without hurrying. I checked the deed once more, both names in typed ink, 1983, parcels 14 and 15 Corridor Road, and set it back in its envelope. I put that in the interior pocket of my jacket beside the letter. I left the ring box on the shelf in the safe. I was not ready for that yet, and I had learned in 74 years to recognize the difference between postponing something out of fear and postponing it because the timing is not right. The ring box would wait. The drive to Court Street took 22 minutes. I went the route that passes Birch Hollow. I do not know if I chose it consciously. The parcels appeared on the left, just past the second light fence line scrub growth cedar stand, exactly as they looked from the kitchen window. Unremarkable. The kind of land a person stops registering after a few seasons. I registered it now. How many times does a man have to ask about a piece of land before someone starts writing it down? Tyler had asked 4 times in 3 years. 4 separate conversations, each documented in Dorothy's notebook, each deflected or postponed. Dorothy had written down every question, every date, every deflection. One of them understood exactly what the other one was doing. I was the only person in the family who had not understood either of them. I drove past without stopping. The cedar stand disappeared in the rearview mirror. I kept my hands on the wheel and my attention on the road ahead, which was a thing I had learned to do many years ago when the temptation was to watch what was behind you. Pennington and Associates occupied the same building on Court Street it had occupied for 30 years. Same dark brick, same brass nameplate beside the door, slightly tarnished at the edges, in a way that signaled tenure rather than neglect. I had been to this office a dozen times across the decades, property closings, Dorothy's trust documents, the children's custodial amendments one by one as they aged into adulthood. I knew the smell before I opened the door. Old wood paneling, paper files, coffee from a machine in the corner that sounded as though it had been running continuously since the Clinton administration. Arthur opened the door himself before I reached it. He stood in the entrance and extended his hand. 30 years, he had never once done that when I walked in. I filed that in the column marked things that matter and did not comment on it. Arthur Pennington, 68 years old, had the stillness that belongs to men who have spent careers reading documents other people find alarming. He shook my hand with both of his. Firm, brief, no excess pressure. He did not mention Dorothy. I was grateful for that. There would be time for that, or there would not. Either way, not this morning. "Raymond," he said, "right on time. The files are already on the table." He led me through the reception area and directly into the conference room. No coffee offered no pleasantries in the hallway. I noted this the same way I had noted his standing at the door. When Arthur Pennington skips the ritual, it is because the substance of the meeting has already made the ritual irrelevant. The conference table held 4 items arranged in a sequence from left to right that I recognized as deliberate: a deed folder, 2 bound assessment reports, and a rolled zoning map held closed with a rubber band. Arthur pulled the chair at the head for me. I sat. He took the chair to my left, which placed both of us facing the documents. I want you to pay attention to what Arthur did next. Not what he said. What he did. He did not open the assessment folder first. He opened the deed folder. There is a reason a man like Arthur Pennington shows you the clean title before he shows you the numbers. He is telling you in what order the facts matter. Title is clean, he said. No liens, no encumbrances. Dorothy asked me to verify that every year since 2019. I did. She never told me you were doing that, I said. He nodded once, as though my saying so confirmed something he had already known. He closed the deed folder and set it to the side. He picked up the rolled zoning map, removed the rubber band, and spread it flat across the table with both palms pressing the corners down until the paper lay still. The map was large. It covered most of the table surface, and I could see Court Street on it, and Birch Hollow and the fence line of the parcels marked in a faint blue boundary. I leaned forward. The edge of the table was solid and cool under my hands. Arthur looked up at me. Raymond, he said, do you know what year the Eastern Corridor rezoning was finalized? I did not. He nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. He kept both palms flat on the map and waited. Arthur put his finger on the eastern boundary line and said this changed 14 months ago. That is when everything changed. He did not wait for me to ask what he meant. He moved his finger slowly along the blue boundary marking parcels 14 and 15 from north to south, tracing the full length of the corridor edge, and explained in the same unhurried voice he used for every document he had ever walked me through. The Eastern Corridor reclassification had finalized 14 months prior. Both parcels had converted from agricultural residential to Class A commercial. The highway expansion project had made that conversion possible. The new interchange 2 miles east of Birch Hollow had made it valuable. I had driven past those parcels every week for 14 months. Nothing on the outside had changed. The fence line was still the fence line. The cedar stand was still the cedar stand. Everything on the inside had been reclassified, revalued, and repositioned by a county planning board vote I had never seen in a proceeding I had never attended. On a pair of parcels I had not thought about as assets since the day Dorothy and I signed the original deed in 1983. Arthur spoke without inflection. That is corridor anchor value, he said. Not residential, not agricultural. Anchor. I understood the word. I had used it in other people's projections for decades. I had never once applied it to anything with my name on the deed. I listened. I did not speak. He moved from the map to the first assessment folder and opened it flat on the table. 3 letters laid in sequence from left to right, each on company letterhead, each with a figure in the upper right corner of the cover page. 35 million, 41 million, 47 million. I had kept other people's accounts for 40 years. I had never once seen a number like that with my own name attached to it. Arthur gave me time with the figures. He did not point to any one of them or indicate a preference. He set them down the way a dealer sets cards face up in order without comment. 3 offers, he said. 35 from a regional retail group, 41 from a mixed-use development firm, 47 from a national commercial developer. All 3 are still active. All 3 are contingent on clean title transfer within 90 days of written acceptance. I looked at the 47 million figure on the 3rd letter. The letterhead was a national firm I recognized. I had seen their projects on the news. Dorothy signed the ND as herself, I said. She did, Arthur said. All three separately. She excluded the children from all correspondence. She told me she wanted the information controlled until you were in a position to use it. She was specific about that. I want you to understand what Dorothy did. She did not hide this from me to keep a secret. She hid it to keep it safe. There is a difference between concealment and protection, and it took me a moment at that table with 3 offer letters in front of me, and her letter still folded in my inside jacket pocket, to understand clearly which one it had been. She had known she was running out of time. She had known the reclassification was recent, and the offers were active and the 90-day windows were finite. She had known also that someone in the family had been asking questions about those parcels since before the reclassification finalized. She had signed the NDAs to keep the offers alive. She had left me the letter, so I would know what I was walking into before I walked into it. I gripped the edge of the table, one hand briefly. Then I let go. Arthur was watching me with the patience of a man who had delivered difficult financial information before, and understood that the first few seconds belonged entirely to the recipient. He did not rush me. He did not offer water or a reassuring word. He simply waited. I straightened in my chair. I looked at the 3 letters again and then back at Arthur. "What else?" I said. He reached down to the credenza behind him, the lower drawer which he had not opened until now, and he set a second folder on the table. He placed it to the right of the offer letters. He let it sit between us for a moment, before he said anything. The name on the cover tab was typed in the same plain font as every other document in this office. 4 letters. Tyler. That is my son's name on that folder, I said. I heard my own voice come out level. I was aware at the time of making a deliberate choice about that. Yes, Arthur said. He did not add anything. He looked at me the way you look at someone you are about to hand something heavy to. Not unkind, just honest about the weight. Read the first 2 pages, he said. Then we will talk. The conference room was very quiet. The old wood smell of the office had been in the air since I arrived, and I had stopped noticing it until that moment, when the silence made everything specific again. I could hear the coffee machine running in the corner. I could hear my own breath, which was even. I was deciding consciously to keep it that way. I looked at Arthur once across the table. He held my gaze without expression. He had known me for 30 years, and he was looking at me now the way he had looked at me when Dorothy's trust documents required my signature on a line I did not expect, present steady. Not pretending the moment was small. I pulled the folder toward me. I opened the cover. Tyler's name was at the top of page 1 and below it a date from 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks before my surgery. I read the first line. My hands went flat on the table. I read it again to make sure I had read it correctly. I set the 2 pages down flat and looked at Arthur. I said, "Tell me what I just read." I needed to hear it spoken out loud by someone who understood it. Arthur did not hesitate. He had been waiting for exactly that question. Tyler had signed a letter of intent to sell both parcels for $28 million. He had signed it as my authorized representative. The buyer was Meridian Commercial Group, a commercial developer whose principals Arthur named without inflection. The LOI was dated 6 weeks ago. The deadline to act on or void it was 3 weeks from today. "I never authorized him," I said. "No," Arthur said. "You did not. That is the problem we are here to discuss." I looked at the document. Tyler's signature was clean and practiced below a typed line that read, "Raymond Calloway by Tyler Calloway, authorized representative." The line looked official. It had been designed to look official. $28 million against 3541.47. I ran the arithmetic without meaning to the way a man does when he has kept ledgers long enough that numbers move before thought does. 28 million against 3541.47. Tyler had not just used my name without permission. He had sold the land at a $19 million discount to a buyer he had approached before my surgery, before the ink was dry on Dorothy's NDAs. Before I had any knowledge this meeting was even possible. Arthur opened the second section of the folder. He set two more documents on the table. The first was a notarized temporary power of attorney citing my post-surgical incapacity. The second was a page from the hospital visitor log, Day 3, printed from the front desk system, with one name I recognized on the third line from the top. Tyler had been in the building on Day 3. Day 3 was the day I received his text about the Henderson contract. I could see the message in my memory, with the clarity that specific details sometimes carry, cannot leave the city. Henderson deal closing will call as soon as I can. I had read that message in the hospital bed and accepted it without question. He had been in my building while he was sending it. He had not come to see me. Arthur explained what he had done instead. Tyler had brought a notary to the ICU during a window when I was sedated. The notary had obtained a fingerprint. The fingerprint appeared on the power of attorney as my authenticating signature. The document had then been used to establish Tyler's authority to sign the LOI as my representative. I need you to hold two things at once. The text on my phone that said he could not leave the city, and the visitor log that put him in my building at the same hour. Both of those things were true at the same time. One of them was my son communicating with me. The other was my son conducting a transaction against me. He had managed both from the same building, possibly the same hour, and I had been unconscious 2 floors above him. Arthur moved to the third section of the folder without ceremony. Nathan had filed a guardianship petition with the county court 8 days ago, citing my post-surgical cognitive vulnerability. The petition requested court-appointed authority over my financial decisions. If the court appoints a guardian before Tyler's LOI deadline, Arthur said, the sale can proceed without your consent or signature. I said the 20 days, all 7 of them staying away. Yes, Arthur said. The abandonment was the setup. A guardianship petition needs a pattern of isolation and dependence on record. 20 days of no contact from your children, no visits, no support, that is the pattern. You gave them 20 days of it without knowing what it was for. I sat with that for a moment. Not with the betrayal I had crossed into the betrayal 2 paragraphs ago, and there was no crossing back, but with the architecture of it. Every excuse, every shrinking text, every empty chair in the hospital room. None of it had been indifference. All of it had been construction. They had been building a legal record around me while I was recovering, and I had cooperated without knowing there was anything to refuse. Arthur finished speaking. The conference room was completely quiet. The coffee machine in the corner had stopped running. The old wood smell of the office was still in the air paper, and decades unchanged by what had just been described inside it. Before I show you how Raymond handled this betrayal, if you are still here, let me know you're walking this path with me. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, shocked or ready. Please keep in mind, the following chapters include fictionalized elements designed for storytelling. If this is not for you, feel free to stop the video here. I looked down at my right hand on the table. My own hand. My own fingerprint lifted from this hand while I was sedated in a hospital bed, placed on a document I had never seen in a room I had never entered, authorizing a transaction I had never agreed to. I looked at it the way you look at something familiar that has been used for a purpose you did not consent to. It was still my hand. That fact had not changed. What had changed was my understanding of what a person was willing to do with it. What do you do when someone uses the body you were born with to sign away something that was never theirs? I sat in that conference room and tried to work that out. I was not in a hurry. I had learned in 74 years that the decisions made in a hurry after something like this are the ones that help the other person, not you. I looked at my hand for a long time. Then I looked at Arthur. I said, "How long do we have before that LOI becomes binding?" He said 22 days, I said, "That is enough. What do we do first?" I stood up. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I fastened the top button of my jacket, the one Dorothy always noticed, and Arthur understood that the meeting had changed direction. Dorothy used to say, "You button that top button when you have already decided and you are just waiting for the room to catch up." She had been right about that, as she had been right about most things. I was only now beginning to properly inventory. Arthur leaned back in his chair, not away from the table, back in the way someone does when they recognize the conversation has shifted and are simply adjusting to the new weight of it. He had been the one with information for the last 90 minutes. He was no longer the one with information. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Three things," I said, in order. I gave them to him without pausing between them. "First, contact Meridian Commercial Group today and place them on formal written notice that the letter of intent was executed without my authorization, consent, or knowledge, and that I am pursuing full invalidation of the fabricated power of attorney used to represent me. Second, prepare a living trust structure for parcels 14 and 15, both with clean title transfer into the trust completed before Sunday. Third, be at my house Sunday evening at 7 o'clock with every document necessary to execute." "Sunday," Arthur said. "That is 4 days." "I know," I said. "I am cooking BBQ. I am cooking BBQ." Arthur blinked once. That was the only sign that I had surprised him. In 30 years, I had never once surprised Arthur Pennington. I considered that a reasonable record and did not feel the need to explain myself further. He wrote the 3 items on his yellow legal pad in the order I had given them, tore the page off cleanly, and set it beside Tyler's folder. Then he stood, which was the second time he had stood for me that morning, and shook my hand at the door. I left the way I came in. The brass nameplate was still slightly tarnished at the edges. The morning had not changed anything about the building. It had changed a number of other things. I drove the same route home. Birch Hollow came up on my left, past the second light the way it always had. I did not look at the fence line the way I had looked at it this morning, with the fresh disorientation of a man seeing something familiar for the first time. I looked at it the way you look at a plan already in motion. Those were not the same experience. Here is what changes when you know what something is worth. You stop driving past it. You start driving toward it. Those are 2 completely different relationships with the same piece of land. This morning I had been driving past it. I was not doing that anymore. I pulled into the driveway at Maple Ridge and sat in the car with the engine off. 90 seconds. I had given myself that. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about the specific quality of her calm, not the absence of feeling, but the management of it, the way she had always been able to hold something difficult without letting it spill. She would have been very calm about all of this. She had been very calm about all of this for years without telling me. I was trying to learn the habit late. I sat in the car for 90 seconds, and then I got out. That was the amount of stillness the morning had earned, and the rest of the day had other requirements. The kitchen smelled the way it had smelled since I came home from the hospital. Familiar and slightly too quiet. I set my jacket over the back of a chair and opened my phone to confirm the grocery order I had placed that morning. Before leaving, the delivery was scheduled for Friday, which gave me 2 days to adjust the list if needed. I confirmed it and set the phone on the table. Then I carried the green notebook from the study to the kitchen table. I set it down and opened it from the back, turning pages forward from Dorothy's last entry toward the pages she had left blank. A ledger does not end when the person keeping it dies. It ends when the last number has been entered correctly. Dorothy had known that. She had left the final pages blank deliberately, the way you leave a column open when you know the closing figure has not yet been confirmed. I found the first clean page after her last line. I smoothed it flat with my palm, the same hand I had looked at in Arthur's conference room, the same hand whose print appeared on a document I had never authorized. It was still my hand. I was reclaiming its uses. I sat down at the kitchen table with the pen Dorothy had kept in the notebook's spine loop. I wrote Wednesday at the top of the blank page. 3 days before Sunday. 3 days to balance a set of books that had been wrong for years. I looked at the blank space below the date for a moment. The white of it, the waiting quality of a page that has not yet been told what it is for. I picked up the pen and wrote the first name. Diane's name was first on the page. I had written it the night before and underlined it once. I called her at 9 on Wednesday morning with my coffee still hot. I had chosen Diane first for the same reason a bookkeeper balances the smaller columns before the larger ones. Not because they matter less, but because the arithmetic is cleaner and the practice steadies the hand. Diane's debt was documented, the amount was specific, and her emotional range was predictable. She would deflect with warmth, and then with history, and then when neither worked with a check. I had known Diane for 45 years. I knew her the way you know a column that always closes short by the same amount. She answered on the second ring, which told me she was not expecting the call to be anything other than routine. "Diane," I said, "are you coming Sunday? I am cooking." She warmed immediately. "Of course, Dad. What do you need? Can I bring anything?" The voice she used for me when she wanted to be the good daughter, which was warm and slightly rushed, as though she had been waiting to offer something. I let her run with it for a moment. Then I said still easy that I had noticed Lisa's car still carried Scottsdale registration tags, and I thought we might settle the rent question before Sunday. It would be cleaner that way. 2 seconds. That is how long it took for Diane's voice to change. I had been a bookkeeper for 40 years. I knew the exact sound of a number someone hoped you had forgotten. She began with the practice years which I had expected. The residency hours, the loans, the years she had spent building something from nothing. All of it true. None of it the point. I listened without interrupting, which I have found is the most efficient way to let a deflection exhaust itself. When she finished, I said the Sunday invitation stood regardless. She said she appreciated that. I said Sunday at 6. Bring nothing. Then I ended the call and wrote a single notation under her name in the notebook. The check arrived in the mailbox the following morning before 9. No note. No envelope with a return address. Just the check folded once with the amount written in Diane's practiced hand. That was Diane's version of an apology, and I did not fault her for the form it took. I recorded it under her name and moved to the next line. Wednesday afternoon, I sent Cooper a text. One sentence: the university registrar had confirmed his withdrawal 11 months prior, and I had canceled the next tuition transfer effective immediately. I sent it at 2:15 and set the phone on the table. He called back in 4 minutes. He was defensive before I had spoken a single sentence. Ask yourself what that means. A man who has nothing to explain does not call back in 4 minutes already arguing. The argument itself was constructed quickly and delivered with the energy of someone who had been rehearsing a version of it for months without expecting to need it this soon. Clerical issue, Dad. Out of context. You do not have the full picture. He used the phrase full picture twice, which was one time more than a person uses it when they actually have one. I let the argument run its full length. This is a skill I had developed over 40 years of professional life, the ability to hold the phone and listen to something unreasonable without needing it to stop. Cooper was not saying anything I had not already accounted for. I was simply waiting for the part where he ran out of new material. When he did, I said, "The transfer is canceled, Cooper." He had more to say. I said Sunday at 6. I am cooking. Then I set the phone down. I set the phone face down on the table. The kitchen was quiet in the specific way it gets after a conversation that will not be forgotten, not silent, but settled the way a room feels when something permanent has been put into it. I opened the notebook and wrote under Cooper's name in the same level hand I had used for Diane. Not a judgment. An entry. I want you to understand something about timing. In a ledger, when you enter a number matters as much as what the number is. I had 2 entries on my page now, each correct, each recorded without drama. The page was beginning to look the way a well-kept account looks when someone is finally attending to it properly. Neither of them had apologized. Diane had written a check, and Cooper had made an argument. I had not expected apologies. I had expected exactly what I received. An apology is an emotional transaction, and I was not conducting emotional transactions this week. I was conducting a different kind. I poured the last of the coffee and sat back in Dorothy's chair. The afternoon had gone gray outside the kitchen window. The notebook was open in front of me with 2 lines entered and 5 more waiting. I had done what I could do Wednesday. Thursday was already arranged. Friday had a name at the top of it that I had not yet spoken aloud. Then the phone buzzed, screen down on the table beside the notebook. Nathan never called without a reason. I watched it buzz once, twice, 3 times, 4, and go to voicemail. I picked up my pen and wrote Friday next to his name on the page. He could think about his reason until then. Nathan called at 7:53 on Friday morning. I let it ring 3 times. On the 4th ring, I picked up and said, "Nathan, good morning." He had prepared something. I could hear it in the first 4 words, the slight elevation of warmth that a person produces when they have rehearsed an opening and are now delivering it. He asked how I was feeling. He mentioned the surgery in a way that made it sound like a mutual hardship we had both endured. Then he said he had been thinking, and that after everything I had been through, it might just be easier if he handled the financial side for a while, just to reduce the load. His words, just to reduce the load. I listened to the full proposal without interrupting. It was well constructed. It had a benevolent surface and a specific legal interior. And if I had not spent 4 days in Arthur Pennington's conference room, I might have received it as concern. I received it as a filing. When he finished, I said, "Sunday at 6, Nathan, can you come?" He said, "Of course," before I finished the sentence. Nathan Calloway had never once agreed to anything before he finished thinking about what it cost him. That was the only tell I needed. I said, "Good. I am cooking." I ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for 11 seconds, I counted, and then I called Arthur. "Nathan agreed to Sunday without hesitating," I said when he picked up. "He never agrees to anything without having already decided how it ends." "The counter-filing was accepted Thursday," Arthur said. "The hearing is next Wednesday." "Bring everything Sunday," I said. "Nothing has changed yet." Arthur said he would. Arthur and I were done in under a minute, which was the right length for that conversation. I set the phone on the study desk and stood at the window. The yard was gray and still in the October morning. The grill was out there unlit, waiting for Sunday in the practical way objects wait when they do not know what they are waiting for. I stood at the window long enough to confirm that the plan was still the plan, and then I went to make breakfast. Saturday afternoon, a number I did not recognize called from a 704 area code. I answered because I answer unfamiliar numbers when I am expecting information from unexpected directions. It was Melissa. She called from a colleague's phone because she did not trust her own. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My daughter was afraid to call her father from her own number. She spoke carefully and at a register slightly lower than her usual voice, the way a person speaks when they are aware that the conversation has weight and they do not want to drop it. She told me 2 things I did not yet have. The first, Nathan had arranged the physician affidavit that accompanied the guardianship petition. Amy had signed it. Melissa said that Amy believed she was signing a wellness check request, a routine form Nathan had told her, something the hospital uses after a significant cardiac event to document family support. Amy had not read the full document. She had trusted her brother's description of what it was. The second, Melissa's husband, Kevin, had said Tyler's name 6 weeks ago in a context he should not have known it. A reference to a commercial corridor, a timeline, a number that Kevin had no independent reason to know. Melissa had understood in that moment what was being built and by whom. She had been afraid to call since. "Come Sunday," I said. "Sit near the door." She said she understood. I believed her. I ended the call and stood in the backyard with the phone in my hand. The grill was in front of me, cold and gray, the grate cleaned and stacked the way I had left it in August. The October air had the smell of a season preparing to close, no smoke yet. No hickory, just cold grass and the faint mineral edge of a sky that had decided it was autumn. I stood there for what I estimated was 3 minutes, turning Melissa's information over the same way I would turn a set of numbers that had just changed the total at the bottom of a column. Then I called Arthur back. "A change of plans," I said. Amy signed the physician affidavit under a false description. She did not know what she was signing. Melissa is coming Sunday as a witness. Arthur said nothing for 2 seconds, which from Arthur was the equivalent of a lengthy response. "Also," I said, "bring everything on Tyler, and bring a notary." "Bring a notary." Arthur did not ask why. A good attorney never asks why when the answer is already visible. What do you bring to a family dinner that requires a notary? You bring an ending. "I will be there at 6, Arthur said. I ended the call and looked at the grill in the gray October light. It was still just a grill. By Sunday evening, it would have cooked a meal and witnessed something that required a legal signature and a witness seated near the door. Those two facts could coexist. I had learned in 74 years that most important things happen in ordinary rooms. I went inside. I opened the green notebook to the Sunday page. 7 names already on it, each with a small notation beside it. I picked up the pen and wrote Melissa at the bottom. Then I drew a small mark beside her name and wrote in the margin near the door. I looked at the full page. 7 names. 1 night. Arthur, a notary, and everything on Tyler. Sunday was no longer a dinner. I lit the grill at 5 in the morning, the same way Dorothy and I used to do it when the children were small, and Sunday meant something different than it does now. The neighborhood was completely dark and completely quiet. I had been awake since 4, moving through the kitchen, with the lights low, making coffee before going out to the backyard. The coals took on the first time, which Dorothy would have said was a good sign. She read significance into small things. I read evidence. On this particular morning, the distinction did not seem important. I worked the grill the way I have always worked it. No rushing, no shortcuts. The same patience I applied to 40 years of other people's numbers. The hickory went on when the coals were right. The smoke rose straight in the still October air, which meant no wind, which meant the temperature would hold. Dorothy always said the smoke told you when the fire was ready. Not the clock, the smoke. I had learned to read it the same way I had learned to read everything she taught me by watching her do it first. Nervous is what you are when you do not know how something will go. I knew exactly how this was going to go. I had known since Wednesday. The smoke was straight, and so was I. The sky began to lighten around 6 that particular October. Lightning that does not come from a specific direction, but seems to arrive from everywhere at once, as though the dark simply decides to reconsider. I was leaning on the back fence post, checking the smoke, when I heard the gate latch and Eunice Braddock came along the fence line on her morning walk. Eunice Braddock, my neighbor of 22 years, was the kind of person who shows up without being asked and without making it a performance. She stopped at the fence the way she always stopped, briefly, comfortably, without any suggestion that she was waiting to be invited to stay. She asked about the grill. I told her Sunday dinner. She nodded and said she could smell the hickory from her back steps and had wondered. Then she said offhand, the way Eunice says most things that are not offhand at all, that she had stopped by every morning during Dorothy's last 2 weeks. Twice with soup. Once with a magazine. She said Dorothy never asked for company and never turned it away. And she said, looking at the fence post rather than at me, which was its own form of courtesy, that Dorothy never said a single word against any of the children. She just kept saying she was glad I would be taken care of. She never said a word against them. Her children were unreachable for 2 weeks while she was dying, and she never said a single word against them. That was Dorothy. That was also the saddest thing I had heard all month. She was always the optimist, I said. I meant it as a deflection. But standing there with the smoke rising straight behind me, I understood it was not accurate. Dorothy had not been an optimist. She had been a planner. Optimists hope things will work out. Planners arrange for them too. The distinction had been in front of me for 11 months, and I was only now reading it correctly. Eunice said to enjoy the dinner and walked on. I watched her go until she turned the corner of the fence line, and the morning took her. Then I went inside. I showered and stood in front of the bedroom mirror, choosing something rather than just getting dressed. The dark blue shirt was in the second drawer where Dorothy had always kept it. She had chosen it in 2009. She said, "Wear it when you mean it." I had worn it 3 times in 15 years. A significant occasion, a difficult conversation, and the day we buried her. This was the 4th. I want you to understand what that table looked like. Everyday plates. A green notebook at the center. One man at the head in a blue shirt his wife chose in 2009. No good china. No candles. Just the account laid out flat, waiting to be settled. I straightened each chair before I sat down. Not because they needed straightening. I had set the table carefully, but because straightening them was the last thing I could do before the waiting began. I sat at the head of the table and looked at the room. The dining room that had held 40 years of meals. Christmas tables, birthday cakes. The one Thanksgiving where Nathan and Tyler did not speak, and everyone pretended not to notice. The room had held all of it. It could hold this. At 10 minutes to 7, the headlights swept the dining room wall. A single arc of light across the plaster, then gone as a car turned into the driveway. I did not move. I heard the engine stop. A car door. Footsteps on the front path unhurried someone who believed they were arriving to something they understood. Then the bell. I had been waiting for them my whole life one way or another. They could wait 10 seconds, I counted. 10 seconds is longer than most people think it is. Long enough for the person at the door to feel it, to shift their weight, to consider whether they rang properly, to wonder if the house is empty. I let it be all of those things. Then I stood. I straightened my collar. I walked to the front door, opened it, and let them in. The first one through the door was Amy. She came alone and brought nothing, and sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded the way she used to sit in church when she was 8 years old. I had not expected her to be first. I had expected Diane, who is chronically early to things she is uncertain about. But Amy came through the door at 7:01 and went straight to the far chair without saying anything, without looking at the notebook at the center of the table, without looking at me. She sat down and folded her hands. That was all she did. I registered it and moved to the door. Diane arrived 4 minutes later with a canvas bag over her shoulder. The corner of a brochure was visible above the bag's edge, a cream-colored paper professional weight. The kind of thing that arrives in a mail merge envelope from an institution with a landscape photograph on the cover. She sat at the table's side and set the bag in her lap and did not take the brochure out. Not yet. Cooper came in without making eye contact with anyone. He pulled out a chair and sat with it angled slightly away from the table center, which I recognized as the physical posture of someone who wants to be present but not accountable. He had his phone in his hand. He put it in his pocket when he sat down and then seemed uncertain what to do with his hands. Tyler arrived at 7:11. He came in with the ease of someone who believed the room had been arranged for his benefit. He shook my hand at the door, a firm, easy shake, the handshake of someone who has decided confidence is the only posture worth committing to. He sat directly across from me, which was the seat of someone who either wanted to watch me or wanted me to watch him. I could not tell yet which it was. He smiled. I let him. Melissa came in at 7:15, took the chair near the door the way she had been asked to, and placed her hands flat on the table in front of her. She looked at me once, and I looked back, and that was sufficient. Jesse sent a voicemail at 6:45. A retreat, paid in advance, a wellness program in the mountains that required a full weekend. The same excuse the Henderson contract had been dressed in different words. I set it in a column by itself and moved on. Jesse was absent. The account would reflect that. 2 document cases, 1 table. Nathan had brought a lawyer to his father's Sunday dinner. I noted that and said nothing. Nathan arrived at 7:19 in a suit. He was accompanied by a man I had not met, Colton, Nathan's family law attorney colleague, who came through the door carrying a second document case and took the seat beside Nathan without introducing himself to anyone else at the table. He set the document case on the floor beside his chair. He opened it without being asked. He was a professional. He had done this before. I returned to the head of the table and sat down. 8 people in the room, 7 chairs, 1 at the table's head. Colton beside Nathan. The green notebook was where I had placed it. The everyday plates were where I had placed them. The hickory smoke from the morning grill was still faint in the air of the house. The same smell as 3 weeks before my surgery, when this family had sat around the same smell and made a set of promises that the next 21 days had catalogued precisely. I want you to look at that table. A nursing home brochure face up in the center of the everyday plates. Diane had put it there when she thought no one was watching. A green notebook beside it. A 74-year-old man at the head who had not said a word yet. Let me tell you which of those things was going to determine the evening. Nathan stood before I had opened my mouth. He had prepared something. He said "we" before he said anything else. And he said it 4 times in the first 30 seconds, which was his way of making a family out of a conspiracy. The speech was careful, and the speech was practiced, and the speech sounded to anyone who did not know the last 3 weeks of this story like the genuine concern of a son who had watched his father survive a cardiac event and wanted to help. He used the phrase "structured support" twice. He mentioned Maplewood Gardens by name, which confirmed that the brochure's appearance at the table center had not been an accident. He mentioned post-surgical cognitive vulnerability without using those words exactly, which told me his attorney had reviewed the language. I listened to every word. I did not move. I did not change the expression on my face. I had kept other people's accounts for 40 years, which had required listening to explanations that did not match the numbers without showing that I saw the discrepancy. This was the same skill. I used it. Nathan's face, when he finished, had the particular quality of someone waiting to be answered, who is confident in the answer they will receive. He sat down. What does it look like when a man takes a room back? Not with volume, not with argument. With the exact length of time it takes to walk from one end of a dining room to the other on a walker in a blue shirt his wife chose in 2009. That is what it looks like. I said, "Before we continue, Nathan, I would like to introduce someone." Nathan's face showed nothing. That was how I knew he was afraid. I pushed back my chair, stood, and took the walker handles. I crossed the dining room at the pace the room required. I used every second of it. I put my hand on the front door latch. Behind me, the dining room was completely quiet. 6 people and a lawyer watching a man with a walker open his own front door. I turned the handle. Arthur Pennington stepped in first. The notary was directly behind him. Arthur nodded at me once and walked to the far end of the table. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. He set his document case on the table and opened it. I returned to the head of the table and sat down. The notary took the chair to Arthur's left and placed her phone on the table face up, the way a person places an instrument they expect to use shortly. Arthur looked once at Nathan's colleague across the table, the 2 of them exchanging the brief professional acknowledgement of attorneys who have arrived at the same table from opposite directions. And then Arthur spoke. "Before you present anything," he said to Nathan's colleague, whose name was Colton, "there is prior documentation you need to see. It supersedes the petition." Colton did not answer. He was a professional. He waited. Arthur removed 2 items from his case and placed them on the table in a sequence I recognized as deliberate. The first went face down, the asset appraisal, the figure inside it still invisible to the room. The second went face up, the fabricated power of attorney Tyler Calloway's signature, visible above the typed line that read, Raymond Calloway, by Tyler Calloway, authorized representative. Arthur smoothed it flat with one palm and left it where the room could read it. Fingerprint. ICU sedation. $28 million. Arthur said it the way you read a column of numbers, flat accurate without editorial. That was what made it land the way it did. He identified Tyler by name. He stated the date, day 3 of my post-surgical recovery. He stated the mechanism, a notary brought to the ICU during a window of sedation. A fingerprint obtained, a temporary power of attorney, fabricated on the basis of it. He stated the Meridian Commercial Group transaction at $28 million and the deadline 20 days from today. He said we are voiding it. He said I wanted your client to hear that at the same time as everyone else. Then Arthur stopped speaking. The room was very quiet. That same smoke still hung in the room, lighter now, but unmistakable, the same smell that had been in this house when this family last sat around a table and promised things they did not keep. I noted the smell. I noted the silence. I did not move. 3 seconds passed. Then Tyler stood. He did not stand the way a man stands when he has been caught. He stood the way a man stands when he has decided the best remaining option is to speak first and reframe quickly. His voice was controlled. His hands were on the back of his chair. He said the LOI had been taken completely out of context. He said it was a placeholder. He said the word protecting. I was protecting the asset while you were, and he did not finish the sentence because a chair scraped at the other end of the table before he could. It was not Tyler's chair. I want you to watch what Melissa did. She did not argue. She did not explain. She took Kevin Pruitt's hand off her arm, Kevin Pruitt, Melissa's husband, who had arrived quietly beside her, and reached for her when Tyler began to speak, and she stayed standing. That is not a small thing. That is a woman deciding in the middle of a dining room which side of a table she is on. Kevin looked at her once. She did not look back at him. He stood without speaking, walked to the front door, and let himself out. The door closed the way doors close when the person closing them has decided not to make a point of it. Tyler was still standing. He had stopped speaking. The reframe had run out of surface. The car started in the driveway. We heard the engine, then the tires on the concrete, then nothing. The silence that came after Kevin's car left was a different quality of silence than the one before it. The before silence had been waiting. The after silence had already arrived somewhere. What does it mean when a lawyer closes his case in the middle of a meeting he came prepared to win? It means the meeting is over. Nathan just had not said so yet. Colton's document case was closed. He had done it at some point during Arthur's presentation, or during Tyler's standing. I had not watched the exact moment, but the case was on the floor beside his chair, and it was shut. That told me everything about where Nathan's attorney thought the legal ground had moved. Diane had not moved from her chair since Arthur opened his case. The Maplewood Gardens brochure was still on the table beside the everyday plates face up, its private suite landscape photograph, and its cream-colored institutional weight suddenly the most out-of-place object in the room. Cooper was looking at the table surface. Nathan was looking at Arthur. I was looking at the room. Amy had not moved from the moment she arrived. Since 7:01, she had sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded and her eyes mostly down. A stillness I had read as the specific presence of someone who knows what they have done and is waiting for the consequence of it. That stillness had held through Arthur's presentation. It had held through Tyler standing. It had held through Kevin's exit and Colton's case closing and the sound of the car pulling away. Then Amy Calloway, 29 years old, the youngest, the one whose presence I had read as simple loyalty, raised her voice for the first time all evening and looked directly at Nathan. I had not prepared for this. Neither had he. Amy's voice was the only sound in the room, and it was smaller than I expected. Not a shout, not a verdict, just a sentence that lands like a hand placed flat on a table. She said she was in Phoenix on the 14th. She said she had a boarding pass. She was looking at me when she said it. Not at Tyler, not at Nathan, at me, as though what she needed most was not to be believed by the room, but to be heard by the one person whose opinion of her still mattered enough to be worth the risk of stating a fact. Arthur did not pause. He said flat that date matches the ICU visitor log. The log shows one visitor on the 14th. Tyler said, "Amy, you don't understand what you're saying." Amy sat back down. She folded her hands. She did not say anything else, and she did not need to. The sentence had done what it needed to do. The room had the boarding pass now, even without seeing it. Tyler had the visitor log. One of those is a document that places a person somewhere. The other is a door that no one checked on the way in. I watched the room absorb it. 3 seconds. Long enough for Nathan to understand that the legal architecture he had built on the affidavit had just lost a load-bearing wall. Long enough for Colton to make a note he did not show Nathan. Long enough for Cooper to stop looking at the table surface and start looking at Tyler. Tyler remained standing. His hands were still on the back of his chair. He did not look at Amy. He looked at Arthur, which told me the reframe had shifted from emotional to procedural. He was no longer trying to explain the LOI. He was trying to find the next surface. Nathan found it first. He pushed the nursing home brochure to the side of the table, a small, deliberate movement, the gesture of a man retiring a prop that has served its purpose, and said, "Dad, this has never been about the land. This has always been about making sure you're taken care of." Colton reached into the document case that had been closed and removed a single page. He slid it toward the center of the table. I read the header without touching it. Emergency petition for conservatorship. Read that word again, conservatorship. Not care, not protection. That word is a lock, and the petition is the key, and Nathan had brought both to dinner. Nathan's attorney said the petition was filed as a protective measure. He said it could be withdrawn. His voice had the tone of a man offering a settlement he already knows will not be accepted in a room where the other side has not yet finished speaking. I noted it internally in the column, where Dorothy's letter had told me this moment would eventually arrive. Dorothy told me someone would say exactly that. She had been right about the sequence, right about the language, right about everything, except which chair Nathan would be sitting in when he said it. Arthur removed a bound document from his case. He set it on the table face up to the right of the fabricated POA. He read one clause aloud, the relevant one, in the same flat voice he had used for every other fact in the last 20 minutes. Dorothy had executed the living trust 11 months prior. It named Raymond Calloway as sole trustee with right of sale. It superseded any subsequent instrument, including the petition. Nathan's attorney said quietly that they would need to verify the notarization date. Arthur said Eunice notarized it. "She is sitting 3 feet from you." Eunice Braddock opened an ink pad on the table without being asked, without being directed, without any expression that suggested she found the moment remarkable. She had notarized Dorothy's document 11 months ago in this same house, and she was prepared to confirm it in this same room on a Sunday evening, with the residual smell of hickory still faint in the air. Colton looked at the notarization stamp. He looked at Eunice. He closed his case. What does a man do when he has already won and no one in the room knows it? Yet he puts his hands flat. He waits. He counts. I placed both palms on the table. Not on the living trust. Not on the notebook. Not on anything, just on the surface of the table my father had built, at which I had sat for 40 years of Sunday meals. The green notebook was to my left. The living trust was to my right. The fabricated POA was face up between them. I looked at Amy first. She met my eyes and held them. Then Melissa near the door, standing where I had told her to stand. Then Diane, who had not moved. Then Cooper, who was watching Nathan. Then Nathan, whose face had the particular stillness of a man choosing his next sentence with extreme care. Then Tyler. Tyler was the only one who did not look away. I left my hands where they were. Amy said barely above a whisper, "Dad." I noted it and did not answer. Not yet. The room needed to sit in this for a moment longer. Dorothy had taught me that the pause before a number is entered is as important as the number itself, that a ledger which is rushed makes errors that compound. I looked at Tyler last. He was the only one who did not look away. That told me everything Dorothy's notebook had not. I left my hands where they were and waited for the room to understand what I already knew. I wrote one sentence, and then I closed the notebook for the last time, not because there was nothing left to say, but because Dorothy had already said it better than I ever could. The house had been empty for 2 hours before I sat down at her desk. They had left in the order they arrived, reversed. Amy first quiet at the door, a nod that carried more than a nod usually does. Then Melissa, who touched my arm once on her way out without speaking, the kind of contact that does not need words because the words would reduce it. Then the rest in whatever sequence they chose, the door closing each time, with the sound of a house settling back into itself. I had one sentence in me. I wrote it in the space below Dorothy's last entry in my handwriting rather than hers, and I did not read it back. A man who reads his own final entry is a man who does not trust it. I closed the cover. I aligned the notebook with the edge of the desk, the way Dorothy always did. I placed the pen across the top. That was the account settled. That was the ledger closed. I sat at the desk in the quiet of the study and did not move for several minutes. The cold coffee was on the corner of the desk where I had left it 6 hours earlier. The cedar and old paper smell of that room had been the same since Dorothy arranged it, and it would be the same after me, and I found that more comforting than I expected. At 11:43, the phone buzzed once. Arthur's forwarded message article, live, Diane, do not respond. I have it. She published at 11:43 p.m. on a Sunday. That is not journalism. That is panic with a byline. I read the article once. Diane had framed the evening as elder manipulation and the living trust as coerced. The language was careful in the way that language is careful when it has been reviewed by someone who understands what careful language is for. I set the phone face down on the desk. Dorothy always said the one who moves first in panic is the one who is already lost. I went to bed. Monday morning, Amy called from her own number. Not through Melissa, not from a colleague's phone, not from a borrowed line, her own registered number. The one I had dialed on the day she was accepted to university, and the day she called to tell me she had passed her licensing exam. I heard the difference before she said a word. She asked, "Dad, can I post what I know, everything, my boarding pass, what I saw?" I waited 3 seconds before answering. Not because I was uncertain, but because the question deserved the weight of 3 seconds. The truth does not need permission, I told her. But I am glad you asked. Post it, she said after a pause that had its own weight. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Notice what Amy did not ask. She did not ask whether the truth was safe. She asked whether it needed permission. There is a difference, and I heard it clearly in the silence between her sentences. 3 hours after Amy posted her account, had 17 times the engagement of Diane's article, and was still climbing. By Tuesday morning, regional outlets were sharing it. I monitored the count once per hour, not from pride, not from satisfaction, in the ordinary sense, but from the same instinct that made me audit a ledger column 4 times before I signed it. I needed the number to be accurate. I needed to know the record was correcting itself at the right rate. Dorothy would have said never argue with arithmetic. She would have been right as she was right about most things. I am only now finishing the work of understanding. Tuesday evening, I read the final share count on my phone. The number was large enough to be a fact rather than a figure, the kind of number that enters a community's memory and stays there. I set the phone face down on Dorothy's desk. The screen went dark. What does a man owe a column of numbers when they finally add up the way they were supposed to? Nothing. He closes the ledger. He reaches for the lamp. I sat in the dark study for a long moment and let one thought arrive. Not a review, not a plan, just a thought, the way a thought comes when the work is done and the room is finally still. Dorothy, I thought, your youngest daughter just did something you would have been very proud of. I did not say it aloud. I did not need to. The study held it the way that room had always held things quietly, without comment, for as long as they needed to stay. After 4 minutes, I reached for the lamp. The light came on and the room was the same room it had always been. I set the phone down. The screen went dark and the room went with it. Then one thought arrived, quiet, specific, and not about any of my children. There was one more thing I needed to do, and I needed to go back to where it had started to finish it properly. The envelope had no printed logo, just a hand-addressed return corner blue ink, slightly uneven lettering, Green Timber Rehabilitation Center, Addison, Vermont. I sat with it at the kitchen table for a moment before opening it. Not from hesitation, from the respect a person pays to something that arrived without being asked for. I had not written to Jessie. I had not sent word through Melissa or Amy or anyone. The envelope had found its own way to the mailbox, the same way certain things find their way when the conditions are finally right. The letter was a single page handwritten on lined paper, the kind of paper that comes in a tablet from a drugstore. Jessie's handwriting had always leaned to the left, as though it was in a hurry to finish the line and return to something else. This was different. The letters were upright and deliberate, the way a man's hand moves when he is paying attention to what it is doing. He wrote about metal. He said metal bends when the load is wrong, not when the metal is bad, and that he had been straightening since August. He said he had earned his first wage the week before, and had not spent it on anything I would worry about. He did not name the amount. He did not make a request. He did not ask me to call. He did not ask for a single thing. In 11 years, that had never happened. Not once. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along the creases he had used his original folds, not new ones, and I placed it inside Dorothy's closed notebook, which was still on the desk where I had left it. The notebook was closed. I did not open it to place the letter inside the cover. I slid it beneath the cover from the front, the way you place a note in a book you intend to keep. Before I left the study that morning, I opened the safe one last time. The ring box was where I had left it in October, on the shelf behind the deed folder. I opened it. Inside, Dorothy's mother's ring, the one she had never worn because she said it was too fine for a machine shop. She had kept it for 40 years without explanation. I closed the box and put it in my jacket pocket. I did not know yet what I would do with it. I knew I would not leave it in the safe. In December, Arthur called from the office. He said the $47 million offer had recorded. He said, "It is done, Raymond." I said, "Good." That was the full conversation. I set the phone on the desk and sat with the number the way I had always sat with a figure before I entered it into a column long enough for it to stop being a figure and start being a fact. Dorothy had said the highest honest offer is the only honest offer. The number was Dorothy's number. It had always been Dorothy's number. I was simply the one who got to confirm it. Arthur also confirmed in the same call that Meridian had acknowledged the invalidation notice in writing. Tyler's real estate license was under review by the state board. Arthur said it plainly, without opinion. I noted it the way I note any closing entry, once correctly and without going back. I drove to Hartwell Regional on my own in mid-December. No walker, no transport, the same entrance I had been wheeled out of 8 weeks earlier. The conference room was on the 3rd floor. Arthur was already there. Grace Ellsworth was already there. And Eunice Braddock was already seated at the far end of the table. Hands folded a cup of coffee in front of her that suggested she had been there long enough to be comfortable. I signed the foundation documents where Arthur indicated. Then I named Grace as director. I said it the way I said most important things once, without preamble, as a fact already established. Grace said she did not know what to say. I picked up the green notebook from the table beside me and slid it across to her in a single motion. I said you don't have to say anything. Dorothy already wrote it down. Notice what Raymond did not say. When he slid the notebook across, he did not say, take care of it. He said Dorothy already wrote it down. He was not giving Grace instructions. He was giving her evidence. I looked at Eunice at the far end of the table. I said I would like you on the advisory board. She said Dorothy said you'd ask. I've been ready. The room went still for a moment. Not from surprise exactly, from the feeling of confirmation, a column closing exactly as it should. Of course she had. Of course Dorothy had told her. The plan had roots I had not yet finished finding. After we adjourned, I walked the 6th floor corridor alone. I had not been back since discharge. The floor had the same smell I remembered from the 20 days recycled air, the faint antiseptic edge, a quiet of a place where time moves differently than it does outside. Room 614 was occupied. An elderly man lay in the bed, 79, perhaps older. His eyes closed, his hands still on the blanket. The bedside chair was empty. I sat in it. I did not introduce myself. I stayed for 4 minutes. I had sat in that chair when no one came. Now I was the one who came. I did not know his name. I did not need to. Grace had already put him on the list. When I stood, Grace was in the corridor doorway. She said already on the list. That is why we built this. I nodded, and we walked back toward the elevator without speaking, which was the right amount to say. Amy was in the main lobby when I stepped out of the elevator. She had not been expected. She was standing near the entrance, not sitting the way a person stands when they have been waiting, but do not want to appear to have been waiting long. She was holding a small pine box with both hands. She said Jesse sent it from Vermont. She said he asked her to deliver it in person. She said he told her give it to Dad and tell him to open it with someone he trusts. Amy held the box with both hands, the way you hold something that took effort to make. The edges had been planed smooth, not sanded planed, and the corners fit without gaps. I had not seen Jesse's hands do careful work in a very long time. The January light came in low and gold through the east window, and I held the box the way you hold something, before you decide whether you are ready, not tight, not loose, just present. Amy sat beside me on the bench without saying anything. The lobby held the quiet of a hospital in the early part of a winter morning. Not silence, but the muted quality of a building that has been holding people's difficult hours for so long that the walls have learned to keep it down. I set the box on my knees and looked at it for a moment. Jesse had planned the edges. He had cut the corners square. I had already seen the outside. It was time to see what he had put inside. I opened the lid. There were 2 items, a folded letter and a wooden keychain, 3 rings on a carved fob, the word Dad, cut into the wood, in letters that leaned slightly left on the first 2 and straightened by the third, as though the hand doing the carving had found its steadiness partway through and decided not to go back and correct the earlier ones. The letters were uneven. He had not fixed them. He had left them exactly as they came out of the wood. That was the whole point. I held the keychain first. The wood was smooth from handling not the planed smoothness of the box's exterior, but the different smoothness of something that had been held repeatedly during the making of it. 3 metal rings, plain, no markings. The fob warm from the box's interior, or perhaps warm from Amy's hands during the drive. I did not ask. Amy said quietly, "He made the box at Green Timber." Mr. Briggs, his woodworking instructor, a retired cabinet maker who had been teaching there since the program opened, taught him the joinery. She said Jesse had been in the shop 6 days a week since September. I set the keychain on my knee and unfolded the letter. Jesse had written about Mr. Briggs. He quoted him directly: "Bent metal straightens best when it is warm." He said he had been keeping himself warm since August. He said he had earned his first wage the week before he mailed the letter. He did not name the amount. He said he had used the money to buy the wood for the box, and that he had enough left for February's rent, and that he had not spent any of it on anything I would need to worry about. Then the last paragraph. He wrote, "The 3 keys are not for any lock. I made them because you have always kept the things that mattered in a place where they could be found. 1 key is for what was. 1 is for what is. 1 is for what you decide comes next. You get to decide that part. I thought you should know. I had not cried at the hospital. I had not cried at the courthouse. I had not cried when Arthur read the trust aloud or when Grace received the notebook. I cried now on a bench in a lobby holding 3 keys that opened nothing with my youngest daughter's hand placed over mine. Amy did not speak. She placed her hand over mine on the bench and left it there. And that was the correct and only thing to do. The lobby continued its muted winter morning around us. Nobody looked. 4 minutes passed, the way 4 minutes pass when they are being used correctly. I looked up through the east window. The Dignity Wing scaffolding was already there, steel poles and cross-bracing the building's skeleton rising in the January light. Look at what is in the window. The scaffolding is already there. Dorothy did not leave me a memory. She left me a building that is still going up. I closed my hand around the 3 keys. Amy sat beside me and said nothing, which was how I knew she understood without being told. I thought about the green notebook which was in Grace's hands now. I thought about the letter Jessie had written in upright, deliberate handwriting on lined drugstore paper. I thought about Dorothy's desk at 11 p.m. on a Sunday, and the smoke from a grill at 5 in the morning, and the 10 seconds I had counted before opening my own front door. I thought about a charge nurse who had booked a transport without being asked. About a neighbor who brought soup twice and a magazine once and never mentioned it. About a youngest daughter who had called from her own number and asked whether the truth needed permission. Dorothy left me a green notebook, a piece of land, and an attorney who kept her secrets for 20 years. But the thing she left me that I nearly missed, the thing I had to spend 20 days alone in a hospital to finally understand, is this: the people who show up are not always the ones you expect. The love that lasts is not the loudest. It is the kind that pulls up a chair and stays. I held the 3 keys in my closed hand and looked at the scaffolding through the glass. Amy did not ask what I was thinking. That is how I knew she already understood. January 2025. Hartwell, that is enough. That is more than enough. Standing here today, I realized that the greatest ledger I ever kept was the one I almost failed to balance. This family story taught me that silence isn't just a lack of words. It's a space where shadows grow. I allowed my pride to blind me to the cracks in my own home, and for that, I nearly paid with my legacy. Don't be like me. Don't wait for a hospital bed to start paying attention to the people sitting in the chairs beside you. I believe God allowed this trial to strip away the illusions I held so dearly. It wasn't about a dad revenge plot or settling old debts. It was about seeing who remained when the smoke cleared. My personal conviction is that a man's wealth isn't measured by the acres he owns, but by the integrity of the hearts he leaves behind. This family story ends not with a victory in court, but with a reclaimed seat at a table of trust. If you seek a dad revenge that truly lasts, let it be the act of building something so solid that no storm can tear it down. In the end, this family story is a reminder that while metal can be bent, a spirit tempered by grace and firm boundaries will always find its way back to center. It is the only dad revenge worth the cost. Thank you for walking with me to the very end of this journey. Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. How would you have handled the betrayal of a child like Tyler? I truly value your unique perspective. If this narrative resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our future uploads. A brief note: while inspired by complex social themes, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this style of content doesn't align with your preferences, feel free to explore other videos that might be a better fit.